Hi, Zizaran here with the first build guide for 321, and this is going to be Pathfinder Toxic Rain, and also likely what I'm link starting as. This has been a very strong build for quite some time, going between being just very strong and one of the strongest, so it's definitely had a lot of time in the light. And what makes this really good is that it is a very good like everything build, kind of a little similar to Explosive Arrow, where it ends up being not just a good league starter, but something that can take out all the Ubers as well, which Steel Mage did when we played Pro SF. We ended up being able to do Ubers, or at least strong enough to do Ubers, even on SSF Hardcore. It is very click intensive, like it's not without downsides. Some of the downsides, which we'll get into later, have been plugged up by this patch. We do end up losing some things, like we actually end up losing damage, so it will not be the highest damage build you'll play. So whether you want to continue investing into this or just have it as a league starter, either way it is a pretty good choice. But with the new weapons and stuff coming in, we don't know if this is going to be something that you play for the entire league. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the build real quick. It's very click intensive. Not everybody likes the play style. Some people end up switching to caustic for clearing. I know Steel did that lastly. You have to like run around, the pods have to explode, and it's delayed damage. Not everybody likes that. Once it's up and going, you have high damage, high tank, high sustain, and it's a very, very nice build. One downside that is happening now is that we don't have access to Eldritch batteries as easy as before. It actually might be very hard to solve the mana issues on this build. That's the main downside. The build doesn't really need much to get going, and you have 16 bows from multiple divination cards, so it's a huge, huge boon as a league starter. If watching these videos helps you have a good league start, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it helps me and my team a lot. So with that said, this is what is going to be my league starter, and with that in mind, we have set up a like skill tree that progresses as you level, so it's very, very easy to follow. And then we have multiple endgame tree here. So we have one where you have built-in EB because the Devouring Diadem has been changed in rarity. And whenever they say changed in rarity, they generally mean that it's been nerfed a lot. This is actually quite good, and that means you have a good endgame item to chase for. One thing I do want to mention, since I'm league starting this, is that you might see my skill tree will be slightly different. If you're wondering why my skill tree doesn't look the same, I'm stance dancing. Another thing that I want to note as well is that Path of Building is currently not being updated as I'm making this video. So you see that there's a dev mode in the bottom left. The reason I say this is we might have this video up before Path of Building is updated, and I don't think you guys should download the dev mode. As soon as POB is updated, you should be able to import. That usually happens before League Start. If this isn't done before League Start, we'll remake a version in the old POB that will be basically the same. You just won't have the new nodes. As for the endgame trees, we have one also that you end up having a 0 mana cost. Then you don't need EB anymore, and then you have the gear here. So you can see that we focused hard on having minus mana cost. And there might end up being minus mana cost on Crucible things as well. That's actually like a very interesting thing that we don't fully know how Crucible is going to change the game. Before, you could level with things like splitting steel, etc., but those leveling skills have been nerfed. So now you are leveling with Caustic Arrow and Toxic Rain and stuff like that. The number one important thing is you want to have a 1.5 attack speed bow. High attack speed is very, very important, especially when it comes to Toxic Rain. And you see that we focus on having no uniques that the build needs. Speaking of gear, there are additional like crafting tips in the notes, and there is basically everything has been answered in the notes. So if you do have any questions, a very important thing for this build that is probably the only unfriendly thing about the build for new players is you want exactly 39% AoE. This didn't always used to be the case, but now it's basically 39% is where you balance the area overlap of each pod of Toxic Rain, as well as them not pushing each other further away from each other. So as you can see in the background, the way this build plays is you have you're right-clicking the ground, the pods are exploding, and that does damage over time. And these stack, so that's why we actually have two setups in this build. For one with the ballista setup and one with when they are self-firing. For bosses or hard enemies, you would put down your ballistas and then right-click your enemy to death. That is another thing that is interesting about this build compared to something like Explosive Arrow, is that you only have high DPS while you're right clicking. It's not like some builds, like for example Stormbrand might have a lot less damage on paper, or Cold Dot, but they have high damage uptime. That is definitely a good thing that we do get a lot tankier this league. Speaking of Ascendancy changes and what makes us tanky this league, is really cool that Master Surgeon is changed now. So it's 50% less life recovery from flasks, but they're not removed when unreserved life is filled. If you're wondering what that means, for our build, it just means that it keeps going. The line is there to prevent low life builds from abusing it. But we also get a really cheap Great Anoint, 15% increased life recovery, but also 25% less damage over time taken during any life flask. So basically every 3 seconds or something, you'll end up hitting your life flask. So you can see here and how nice it is, you get 6,300 life over 4.6 seconds. You could technically get more with an Eternal, but that would be even spammier. So with this, you would only have to click it around every 4 seconds. Another thing that's important to mention for the build is that we're going to do things like this, used when charges when reached full. And to help permanent flask uptime, you can get 26 and 28 quality by having Hillock in Research. And that'll make the flasks last even longer. That means that you actually get to use full flasks for any boss fight. This is really good, particularly with, say you're going to do Exarch, you put in a Ruby flask. If you're going to do Eater, you put in a Topaz. Uber Elder, you put in a Sapphire, and it gives you a lot of mitigation there. So a lot of fun things to play around with permanent flasks. It also makes you incredibly fast at bosses because you have permanent onslaught and the Quicksilver, so you're just running around at full speed and hopefully making it easier to dodge and not harder. A thing that's really important to mention, that if you are swapping to the reduced mana cost setup, make sure you copy paste, so Control-C, Control-V, your gear into Path of Exile first and really simulate that you are actually going to hit 0 mana cost. If you even have 1 mana cost, it won't be playable. You also have to make sure that Malevolence and Withering Step cost 0. However, if you have Cast of No Mistaken in the same set as Withering Step, even though it doesn't actually apply to it, it'll increase the mana cost, so just untick it there to make sure that it says mana cost 0. And here you can also see that Malevolence is 0, so make sure you've checked all of those before you swap over or you're going to have a bad time. A quick tip for farming your first 6-ink bow, we don't actually know what map is at what tier, but let's say for example Terrace, Gardens, or Courtyard, where the 6-ink div card drops, is a tier 3 or tier 4 map. If that is the only map of that tier, and you just keep going above it by 1 or 2 tiers, once you do drop a tier 3 map in a tier 5, well, if Courtyard is the only tier 3 map you have, that's the only one you'll get. So keep that in mind. It's a little bit advanced for new players, but I did want to mention it because you can't remove maps for the Atlas. Divcards.io is a great site to see where different cards drop, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind because getting a 6-ink bow is so important for this build. Either way, I hope you guys have an amazing time in Crucible and that this build helps you have a great league start. Another thing that's great is that it doesn't really matter if a lot of people play this because there's not any crazy uniques we need except the diadem, which, you know, as you saw, we haven't planned for. It should all be very doable to gear the build yourself without relying on trading. So thanks so much for watching. Sub if you liked the video, and more importantly, try to die less than I do.